All right, welcome. All right, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Rockthevox here with a handy little guide to understand what exactly I'm going to be talking about. It would help immensely for your understanding as far as learning what is going on here in terms of what I'm talking about. If you went over to Motor Trend's channel and watched their video of the latest episode of Engine Masters, which is currently episode 18, stock versus stroker, I think, where they take two small block Chryslers. One's a 410 stroker kit from Blueprints, where the other is a junkyard jewel that's been dressed up and made better, the 360. And they went on to discuss extensively information about the cam, how it's the same camshaft in both have the same bore, both are using the same stuff, this, and that. And the only difference really is the journal size, and that's not even addressed. And I would imagine the journal size is the same because they're both 360 blocks. But more importantly, the stroke length, which is drastically different. It's a 4-inch stroke in the 410 and a 3.582.125 stroke in the 360, something like that, or 367 because it's been overboard 40 thou. But regardless, what I'm going to be discussing here today is the advantages and disadvantage of undersquare, oversquare, and square motors. Now, let's talk at length about what really governs a square versus an undersquare versus an oversquare motor. An undersquare motor is a motor that has a stroke length longer than the diameter of the piston in the cylinder bore. For our example, I'm using the same numbers twice, which the numbers come from, these are, for reference sake, all of these are 331 V8 small block style engines. The first one I specifically mention is the info used is based on a first generation Hemi 331 engine that was, I guess you could call it a small block Hemi, air quotations, and it was one of the more stout Hemi V8s that Chrysler ever produced, and it was one of the contenders up there along with the 392. I need to make this point very clear. There is no replacement for displacement. I cannot stress this enough. But if we're talking the same engine displacement, apples to apples, one that's got a longer stroke, like an undersquare motor, is typically going to produce a lot more low-end torque, demonstrated here by the orange line. All the orange lines are your torque band, all the purple lines here are your horsepower band. Now, let's just call this 7,600 RPM at the edge of the light blue line here. 7,600 RPMs. And an undersquare motor, like most diesels, for instance, that I'm aware of, will most times produce more low-end torque than any of the other two motor designs, most of the time, for its particular volume setup. A square motor, by comparison, has a bore that is the same diameter as the length is in stroke. For this example, it is 3¼ inch by 3¼ inch stroke via bore, making it a square motor. Following along, it forms a square in the diagram. An over-square motor, which is what you see in a lot, and I mean a lot, of F1 cars, is why those motors can get up to such ridiculous engine speeds. 10, 15, 20,000 RPMs and the like. It's because they might have something of the likes of a 4-inch bore with a 1-inch stroke, which is an absurd, and I do mean absurd, difference. Ask how All-American Racing won their series. They'll tell you it's the same principle. Anyways, getting back to this. For example, our first-gen Hemi has a 3.8125 bore by a 3.86 or 3.8625 stroke, making it a very over-square motor. Now, I'm not pulling up actual power statistics and figures, and I'm sure there are dyno sheets out there for this particular motor that have been completely rebuilt to bone stock condition in the same configuration that'll show you what it's actually making. I'm guessing somewhere in the 320, 340-ish range, horsepower-wise, and at least 300 pound-feet. Probably more because it's a Hemi. Regardless of that, what you'll see, because all these V8s that we're discussing here are the same engine displacement, 331 cubic inches. What we're looking at is the power curves. That's really where you're going to see the difference. An over-square motor just keeps building and building and building and building, and eventually about 4,000 to 5,000 RPMs, you're going to lose your peak torque, but not your peak horsepower. That'll probably keep going until I would say somewhere in the neighborhood of 67 or 7,300 RPM. Whereas your square motor, much lower numbers, but in theory, all these motors put out the same amount of horsepower and pound-feet of torque. It's how quickly they get there, too. In most cases. That's realistically what you're looking at. Now, if I'm not mistaken, we take our undersquare motor. It's going to have a very flat horsepower curve because it cannot get up to the RPM that an oversquare motor can. There's a reason for this. Stroke in inches times RPM, a given number, divided by 6 gets you a piston speed in feet per minute. Note that OEM stock bottom ends are not really safe beyond 4,000. Now, that's the big factor. That's why F1 cars can go so fast. Not only they're built up race motors that are making insane amounts of horsepower per their size, but they can reach these absurd engine speeds because their stroke is so much shorter than everything else. For example, if I remember the numbers correctly, the bottom end of my V6 is basically that of the 318 small block Chrysler. That stroke is 3.31 inches. I did the math. The safe, you don't really want to go over 44,000 RPM by too much. The safe RPM red line, I call it, be 7,400 RPM. I wouldn't go past 74, personally speaking, because that's 4,085, something like that. So that's like, nope, we're not going any farther with that. Because beyond that, you're risking rod knock, and you're going past what the OEM safe recommendation is, even though most OEM motors are only going to red line at 5,600 RPM. Regardless of that, basically, you're looking at safe engine speeds. and I'm about to run out of time. And welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Rockthevox back here again. I just had to get done doing some calculations after the video ran out. And what this basically amounts up to is safe engine speeds. Now, admittedly, even with like forged pistons, forged rods, forged crank, there's still a limitation on how fast you can run your motor. And realistically speaking, even if you can run it out to 8,000 RPMs, which I would not recommend unless you know what you're doing and your motor can handle that, chances are it might go boom if you try to. The reason being is there's an OEM safe limit of about 4,000 feet per minute. That's your piston speed. Anything past that, you're starting to put a real strain on your rod cap bearings, on your crank cap, on your crank bearings, and even on the elbow joints in the pistons themselves that hold them to the connecting rods. And it seems that the magic number for a safe limit is about 4,000 RPMs. You might be able to get to 45, but you're really pushing it past 41. In fact, I wouldn't recommend going past 41. Like, to me, that's like Danger Will Robinson. Now, for our example, we have three numbers and three different equations. The equation is stroke in inches times RPM. That output then gets divided by 6, and that'll give you your piston speed in feet per minute. Now, again, the magic number is about 4,000 feet per minute, or thereabout. You can be a little over if you're like 41 on the nose, then yeah, you should probably go just maybe 100 RPM lower, or maybe 50 RPM lower, or something like that, just to err on the safe side. But if you can keep it under 41, you're good. The closer you are to 4,000, the better off, though, I would recommend. In fact, you could probably turn these numbers down that I'm displaying right now just a hair's breadth, and you'd probably be safer. But a reasonable expectation for a 331 Hemi with a stroke of 3.625 for a safe estimate anyways would be somewhere in the neighborhood of 6,700 RPM. Probably more like 66, but 67 is about really the limit. You might be able to get like 50 RPM more, but realistically, who the fuck can tell 50 RPM difference on a fucking speedo gauge? Maybe 100 RPM, and definitely 1,000, but 50? No. And that's a reasonable expectation for an over square motor. Now let's move on to our 3 3/4 by 3 3/4 square motor of the same displacement. A safe number is about 6,500 RPMs. You're noticing something here, right? Now the reason being is because, again, 4,000 feet per minute. That's the magic number. That's where things start to wear out a little more faster than they should. And we go down the line to our under square motor, it's even lower than that. And it's in fact the closest that I've gotten thus far to 4,000 feet per minute at 6,300 RPM, which admittedly is still a really high number in comparison to, say, some of the F1 cars, which can whiz up to 20 grand, some of them even. Good fucking God, that's a high engine speed. Now, admittedly, this is for piston engines. For all you rotary fans out there, I don't know what the fuck to tell you. You need to look up some other shit, because that voodoo garbage that's a smog producer, get the fuck out of here. Thou shalt not bring vile apex failure seals to me. But yeah, 4,000 feet per minute, if you can stay under that, that's good. And this is why, in some instances, an over square motor is better than an under square motor. Now, if you're looking just for a torque monster, then what does it matter? But if you're looking for something that you can just keep your foot on the gas and it not care for a while, over square might be your best option. Again, this is why you never really hear about square motors, because they're really the best of both worlds. They give you relatively happy RPM limits while still producing a fair amount of torque. And that's why you never hear about them, because they're the ideal motor. But companies don't want ideal. They want stuff that does break, so you have to go to a mechanic shop, or you have to go to their shop, because then they can charge you. But they don't do that anymore, thankfully. So the bugs are now going out of mechanical and into the electrical. Anyone who's ever owned a early 2000s Nissan Titan with the 5.6 will tell you the mechanical on that engine never once had a problem with it. But if you bought like a 2001 Nissan Titan 5.6 V8, you would know that you've gone bow to stern on that entire fucking truck trying to track down an electrical gremlin. And admittedly, it's probably some of this really annoying bullshit about how all the ECU has to be connected to this, to this, to this, and this has to say that it's connected to. Same problems with the Hellcat. Regardless of that, realistically, you need to know as much as you can about your motor if you're really going to do any kind of long-term racing. And even if you're not going to be doing any kind of racing, it's helpful to know this information, because then you know how hard you can push your motor. Say you're a truck guy and you're looking at, I don't know, a big block Chevy 502 or something like that. This information will help you. Now, admittedly, forged stuff is going to help a lot. You can get to higher numbers, but you need to take into account that's going to be a different calculation number. You might be able to get up to 5,000 feet per minute, but you're really, and I do mean really, going to have to research that information. I can't tell you that. This is just for like Joe Schmuck who wants to bury the pedal every now and then. But I think that's enough for this video, and I shall see you in the next video, whenever that may be. In the meantime, peace.